It's November 2024 and I bought every projector on Amazon priced less than $100, so we can sift through the marketing and occasional flat out lies on their listings. And unfortunately, for the most part, you guys are buying the wrong stuff. But it's really not your fault. In this video, we're going to actually test their brightness, contrast, fan noise, focus, and resolution. We're going to put them side by side in a picture quality test. And last, I'll do some more in-depth input lag and speaker quality testing of the best ones to figure out which projectors are worth your money and which ones are mostly e-waste. And as always, there are no sponsored reviews on this channel, and I bought all these projectors with my own money. Starting out with brightness testing, it's still pretty common for these projectors to list ridiculous brightness numbers, like 15,000 lumens. And while that's technically not a lie, it's just the brightness of the actual LED light source inside of the projector, and it isn't anywhere close to the amount of light that reaches the screen. I tested each of these 25 projectors using the ANSI standard, where you take 9 individual brightness readings and multiply the average brightness by the screen size in square meters to get the number of ANSI lumens. And unsurprisingly, none of the projectors had 15,000 lumens, but the brightest projector by a pretty significant margin was the $99 Groview JQ818C, measuring 492 ANSI lumens. And then a big chunk of these projectors were around 200 ANSI lumens, and unfortunately, 3 of the most purchased cheap projectors on Amazon were under 100 ANSI lumens. I also measured their contrast by dividing the brightness of a pure white screen by the brightness of a pure black screen, and I found out that the $99 Onoyo AY2 Pro came out on top with a very impressive 4,500 to 1 contrast ratio, but overall the contrast of most of these projectors is very good, and the large majority were over 2,000 to 1, which is extremely competitive even with much more expensive projectors. However, one area that these cheap projectors struggle in is brightness uniformity, where the center of the image is significantly brighter than one or all of the corners. And unsurprisingly, the second dimmest projector, the $59 IGRR, had the highest uniformity at 72.7%. But amazingly, the brightest projector, the Groview JQ818C, had the second highest at 69.9%. Another issue that these cheap projectors struggle with compared to more expensive ones is fan noise. Since projecting a 15,000 lumen light source through an LCD screen that absorbs 97% of that light generates a lot of heat. And I measured each projector's fan noise from a distance of 12 inches, and I found that the quietest was the $89 Onoyo AY3 with a fan noise of 39.9 decibels. But some other notably decent performers were the Vopul's N3, Onoyo AY2 Pro, and the Haparon H1, which had high lumens but low fan noise, and the loudest projector by far was the extremely popular HY320 that's all over the TikTok store, and that came out at an overwhelming 51.6 decibels. Next, I tested their throw ratio, which is the distance required for your projector to produce a certain size of screen. And here are the throw distances for a 100-inch screen, with some notable measurements being the Haparon and the Groview that needed between 125 and 135 inches for a 100-inch screen, which is longer than most projectors. And on the other end of the spectrum, the small HY300 only needs 79 inches to produce a 100-inch screen, which technically classifies it as a short throw projector. Another place where these companies try to trick you on their listings is by putting things like 1080p or 4K supported in their titles. And all that means is that you can feed them 1080p or 4K content, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they could display that resolution, which would be called their native resolution. Usually a quick search of the listing will show you the true native resolution, but I have suspicions that even some of those numbers can't be trusted, since this extremely popular projector from Pensaba that sold 6,000 units last month claims to be 1080p, but in the side-by-side testing you can see that it doesn't properly display 1080p content, and it squishes the entire image vertically, which is usually a sign that it's not using its native resolution. Along with resolution, I tested their focus quality when lined up perfectly with the screen. I started out by projecting this image and focusing the center perfectly. Then I inspected the text in all 4 corners, and I rated their quality from 1 to 10. And I found that the best focus uniformity was from the Onoyo AY3, the Groview JQ818C, the Dragon Touch LO12, and the Solange HY320, which are all true 1080p native projectors. And usually combining brightness, contrast, and resolution together will give you a good indication of the projector's overall image quality, but there's really only one way to know for sure, so I set up 2 identical 100-inch screens, and I put the projectors head to head, going from the least expensive to the most. And I do have 25 projectors here, which means 24 rounds, so I'm going to move pretty quickly through any rounds that weren't necessarily close. Like round 1 that had the Arcia YG210 on the left and the Vopals N3 on the right. And neither of them looked great, but the Arcia is essentially garbage with 25 ANSI lumens and a 480p native resolution, so the N3 easily moved on. Round 2 brings in the Pensiba HI04 on the left and the Vopals N3 on the right, and you can see that the Pensiba actually does a better job with color, but as I mentioned earlier, it squishes the aspect ratio of the video, and the brightness was still too low at just 76 lumens, so the N3 moved on again. Round 3 then put the Seabest W13S on the left and the Vopals N3 on the right, and similar to the last round, the W13S did a good job with color, but the focus was soft and the brightness was low, so the N3 took this round also. And that meant that round 4 was the Elephas BL128 on the left and the Vopals N3 on the right. And you can tell that the BL128's color was much better than the N3, which was bright, but pretty washed out in bright scenes. And to me, it seemed like the increase in color performance was worth the decrease in overall brightness, so the BL128 moved on. And that made round 5 the Elephas BL128 on the left and the Niso M10 on the right. And while it wasn't quite as bad as the Arcia from round 1, the Niso was pretty terrible with just 74 ANSI lumens and an incorrect aspect ratio that squished the entire image vertically, so this round wasn't close. Round 6 put the Elephas BL128 on the left and the Vispel V16 on the right, and this round was pretty close with both projectors doing a decent job with colors, but I thought that the Vispel looked a little bit too harsh in bright scenes, and in darker scenes the Elephas had much brighter highlights, making the image look more contrasty and easier to watch, so the Elephas moved on again. Round 7 then put the Elephas B128 on the left and the Hapron H1 on the right. And the Hapron really showed off why it's been my pick for the best projector under $75 for the last 2 years, with nice saturated colors, good brightness, and excellent contrast, easily beating the Elephas and moving on. And that made round 8 the Groveview B20 on the left and the Hapron H1 on the right. And honestly, the B20 looked pretty good, but ultimately not anywhere close to as good as the Hapron H1, which was brighter with better color and better contrast in both bright scenes and in dark scenes. Round 9 put the Dragon Touch LO12 on the left and the Hapron H1 on the right. And this round wasn't close at all, and the LO12 had splotchy color skewed heavily towards blue and pretty bad contrast with milky gray blacks, so the Hapron moved on again. And that made round 10 the Bejovial HY300 on the left and the Hapron H1 on the right. And honestly, for a 720p projector with 144 ANSI lumens, the HY300 actually didn't look bad at all, with good color and decent contrast. But again, it just wasn't anywhere close to the quality of the Hapron, which moved on again. Round 11 then put the Opoco B158 on the left and the Hapron H1 on the right. And for two projectors with pretty similar stats, this round was not as close as it should have been, with the Opoco looking pretty dull and lifeless in both light and dark scenes, meaning the Hapron was going to move on again. Round 12 was then the IGRR V20 on the left and the Hapron H1 on the right. And the fact that a 52 lumen 480p projector costs more than the Hapron makes you realize just how impossible it is for the average consumer to pick a projector. And in addition to poor brightness, bad color, and low resolution, the V220 also didn't display the aspect ratio properly, so the Hapron moved on. Round 13 is past the halfway point, and it puts the Clockwo M8 on the left and the Hapron H1 on the right. And again, this was not particularly close, and not only did the M8 have poor colors and contrast, but it also had a bright white spot in the bottom middle of the screen, probably from some kind of internal reflection. Round 14 has the Halimomo H500 on the left and the Hapron H1 on the right. And as noted previously, the Halimomo's focus uniformity is atrocious. But even more than that, it seemed like the Halimomo was trying to do some kind of motion processing, which caused stuttering and tearing that I've never seen on one of these cheap projectors before. So in spite of decent resolution and brightness, the Halimomo was actually one of the worst performing projectors yet. And that made round 15 the very popular Magic Cubic HY320 on the left and the Hapron H1 on the right. And again, a combination of bad color and low contrast made this no contest at all, and an easy win for the Hapron without even considering the fan noise of the HY320. Round 16 then put the Yabber E1 on the left and the Hapron H1 on the right, and this was definitely closer, but for some reason the Yabber E1 made everyone's skin look weird and bumpy. And I've watched this same scene hundreds of times in 4K on projectors that cost thousands of dollars, and I can definitely tell you that it's not supposed to look like that, so the Hapron H1 moved on again. Round 17 put the TMY SPP on the left and the Hapron H1 on the right. And again, this was much closer than some of the previous rounds, but to me, the TMY was a little bit dull and undersaturated, so the Hapron won this round also. In round 18, the Pensaba QK06 was on the left and the Hapron H1 was on the right. And this was maybe the closest round yet, but I thought that the QK06 made skin tones a little bit too orange in bright scenes, and in dark scenes, the contrast and gamma on the Hapron were just much easier to watch. So I also picked the Hapron in this round. Round 19 was then the Solange HY320 on the left and the Hapron H1 on the right. And again, this was a pretty close round in bright scenes, but the Hapron's color was definitely still more accurate and saturated, and in darker scenes, it was no contest, and the HY320 was way too dim compared to the punchy highlights of the Hapron. And the Hapron moved on without even considering the extremely loud fan noise of the HY320. And that made round 20 the Vanvo VF320 on the left and the Hapron H1 on the right. And in bright scenes, the Vanvo was slightly less saturated than the Hapron, but I felt like it actually led to a little bit better color accuracy. And I was also impressed with the sharpness of the VF320, which very confusingly is a 720p native projector, so you wouldn't expect great sharpness. But to me, it seemed like it showed more detail in faces and skin without looking like the Yabber did a few rounds earlier. And in dark scenes, the VF320 had great color and great highlights, and I would have never expected a 720p projector to take down the Hapron after 14 rounds, but I think that the Vanvo earned the win here. So round 21 was the Vanvo 320 on the left and the Onoyo AY3 on the right. And again, the Vanvo was just so much sharper in bright scenes, and the AY3's black levels were a little bit muddy and gray. So the Vanvo easily moved on through this round. In round 22, the Vanvo VF320 was on the left and the Onoyo AY2 Pro was on the right. And in bright scenes, they were very similar, with the Vanvo's sharpness sticking out to me again, but the dark scene performance on the AY2 Pro was the best we've seen yet. And it managed to get great bright highlights while maintaining excellent black levels due to its huge 4,500:1 contrast ratio. So with similar performance in bright scenes and dominating performance in dark scenes, the AY2 Pro easily took this round. And that meant that round 23 was the Toptro TR23 on the left and the Onoyo AY2 Pro on the right. And unlike the last few rounds, this one wasn't particularly close. And while the TR23 wasn't bad by any means, it was just 70% as bright as the AY2 Pro with only 25% of the contrast. So it didn't really have a chance, and the AY2 Pro moved on again. And that made the final round the Groview JQ818C, which just recently started to regularly sell for less than $100 on the left, and the Onoyo AY2 Pro on the right. And the Groview is over 2.5 times brighter than the Onoyo, which in person makes bright scenes much more vibrant. Though you can tell that the colors weren't nearly as accurate as the AY2 Pro. And that brightness also helped scenes with medium lighting appear to be higher contrast on the Groview. But in the darkest scenes, the AY2 Pro did have better black levels and overall contrast. And ultimately, I picked the Groview, but if color accuracy is more important to you, then the AY2 Pro would probably be a better pick. And that makes this the overall ranking for picture quality, and from this point on, I'm going to narrow down my test to just the top 5 and do a little bit of additional testing. Starting with input lag, which is the delay between when the video signal goes into the projector and when it gets shown on the screen. And in general, input lag numbers under 20 milliseconds are very good for gaming. Between 20 and 50 milliseconds is acceptable but not great, and anything above 100 milliseconds will not work for gaming. Of the top 5 projectors, the Vanvo had by far the best input lag, locked in at 19.3 milliseconds for perfect 1080p 60Hz gaming. And that's followed up by the Groview and the Hapron, which bounced between 35 and 45 milliseconds depending on the frame, which, as I said, is acceptable but not great. And the Onoyo AY2 Pro bounced between 65 and 78 milliseconds, which would start to feel a little bit strange when trying to game on it. And the Toptro TR23 was well above 100 milliseconds, meaning you can't really use it for gaming. I also tested the speaker quality and volume of each of the top 5 projectors, and here they are from quietest to loudest with my subjective audio quality score overlaid.
Julio, good to see you. You got something for us?
From a new ally, a spy in the First Order.
A spy. Julio, good to see you. You got something for us?
From a new ally, a spy in the First Order.
A spy. Julio, good to see you. You got something for us?
From a new ally, a spy in the First Order.
A spy. Julio, good to see you. You got something for us?
From a new ally, a spy in the First Order.
A spy. Julio, good to see you. You got something for us?
From a new ally, a spy in the First Order.
A spy.
So it's conclusion time for 2024, and unfortunately I don't think that there is one perfect option that ticks all the boxes, but I've definitely still got recommendations. First, for the third year in a row, I think that the Haprun H1 is the best projector for most people. It has higher than average brightness, contrast, sharpness, and uniformity. It finished 4th overall in the side-by-side testing. It's got acceptable input lag for casual gaming, speakers that are loud enough and of acceptable quality, and fans that aren't too terribly noisy or distracting. And maybe most importantly, it can often be found on sale for less than $50, which makes it by far the best value. Also, just to double check Haprun's quality control, I bought a brand new H1 this year to compare to my 1-year-old model, and the new one actually had better brightness and contrast. So I feel confident that you'll get the exact same performance as me. And don't forget to get it set up correctly using my setup and calibration video. If you're looking for something smaller or you're focused specifically on gaming, the Vanvo VF320 is compact with good brightness, contrast, and above average brightness uniformity. And it's got great input lag numbers for gaming and loudspeakers that sound surprisingly decent, with the downsides of the Vanvo being a louder than normal fan that clocks in at 47.3 decibels, and 720p native resolution, though that didn't stop it from finishing 3rd overall in picture quality. If gaming isn't as important to you and you just want the quietest projector with good picture quality, the Onoyo AY2 Pro finished 2nd overall in the side-by-side testing. It had the highest contrast of any of the projectors, and it has a very quiet fan at just 41.3 decibels. If you want the brightest option under $100, that is the Groview JQ818C, which is over 2 times brighter than the next brightest projector and consequently finished 1st in the side-by-side testing. The Groview also had the loudest speakers and acceptable input lag numbers for gaming. But all that brightness comes at a cost because the fan is louder than most at 48.4 decibels. And the Groview is roughly 3 times as big and uses 3 times as much power as the rest of the projectors in the video. Still, almost 500 ANSI lumens for $99 is pretty incredible. And last, if you need a little bit of flexibility in placement, I also kind of admit to liking the TikTok famous HY300 due almost entirely to its little aiming stand and short throw ratio. And it also has 4-point keystone and a 44.4 decibel fan. But be aware that people have reported some issues with the Android operating system freezing often. It uses a Netflix app that's designed for cell phones, and it has almost 200 milliseconds of input lag, which means no gaming. But it is pretty neat for $50, especially if you're just gonna watch YouTube. As always, there are no sponsored reviews on this channel, but I do have links for all the projectors down in the description. And as always, I appreciate when you use those links, since as an Amazon affiliate, I do earn a small commission on the sale at no cost to you. I'd also like to thank all of my awesome patrons over at Patreon for their continued support of my unsponsored content. And if you're interested in supporting my channel, please check out the links down in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and as always, thanks for watching The Hookup.